Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 114. At this point in the class, we're examining the final phase of the class, where we examine the Reconstruction period, the period after the Civil War. We had our first lecture on this third and final time period under review, America Reborn, recently. Where we sketched out the meanings and possibilities of Reconstruction and introduced you to the four different players in the story. Here we begin a series of lectures to wrap up the course, which will examine the actual events and political machinations of Reconstruction. We're going to see now how Reconstruction actually plays out after first thinking about what Reconstruction could mean. And here today we'll begin the first of two lectures examining the first two periods of Reconstruction. The first two periods of Reconstruction are presidential Reconstruction, where the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, will attempt to steer Reconstruction in a certain way. For reasons we'll talk about here, that will spark a backlash and open the door to the second period of Reconstruction, a period known as Radical Reconstruction. And then in our final two lectures in the course, we'll examine what is known as the retreat from Reconstruction, or ultimately the failure of Reconstruction, that third phase, which is why we rightfully today see Reconstruction as this tragic era where the nation failed to create equality and opportunity for all. So there are three phases to Reconstruction: presidential Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, and the retreat from Reconstruction. And in our final lectures here, we will examine those three different periods. Let's begin with the first phase of Reconstruction, a period known as presidential Reconstruction. And it is a phase where, again, the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, is attempting to steer Reconstruction in line with his imperatives and in response to that conciliatory approach that most Americans favored when Reconstruction began. Andrew Johnson is the President of the United States because of a contingent factor, because of a random event that no one could foresee, but one of great consequence: the assassination of Abraham Lincoln days after the Civil War ended. Quite often in human history, it is these contingent events, these random events, that have the greatest impact. We like to imagine human history is a process of deliberate action. It is a process of people exerting their free will to steer human events in a certain way. But actually, any study of history reveals that often what matters the most are things that no one could foresee, that seem to indeed be completely contingent. John Wilkes Booth sneaks into Ford's Theater. He has a one-shot revolver. He fires that shot. He kills Lincoln. And American history forever changes, because rather than the nation led by Lincoln, the nation would be led by this man, Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner by birth, who rose through the ranks of Tennessee state politics, serving as a congressman, governor, and then finally senator from Tennessee. And he is the only sitting senator from a seceding state to remain in Washington, D.C. and remain part of the U.S. Senate. Of course, he was outnumbered and outvoted by Republicans, but the reason why Johnson does this is that though he was a Southerner, though he was a former slave owner, and though he was a clear white supremacist, he supported slavery, but did not support secession. He's one of this odd group of Southerners that we've attempted to thread into our story here in History 114, of the Southerner who supports slavery, who is fully inculcated in the values, ideologies of a slave society, but remain loyal to the Union. And that's why Lincoln chose him as his running mate in 1864, when Lincoln is running for re-election and everything is on the line. The war, the Emancipation Proclamation, and really the entire fate of the United States on the line in 1864. Lincoln realized he had to win. He had to win in order to continue the war and save the Union, as he was opposed by George McClellan, who ran as an anti-war candidate who promised to end the war by allowing the South to secede from the Union. So Lincoln will win in a very clear, emphatic victory, but leading up to that, for the reasons we enunciated in previous lectures, he was very worried about his re-election chances. And so he got rid of his sitting vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who had run with him in 1860, And he chose Andrew Johnson to be his running mate as a symbol of comity, of harmony, of nationalism, a national unity ticket. Lincoln, the Northerner, the Republican, the man who was owning the Emancipation Proclamation, with the Southerner, Andrew Johnson, who symbolized this idea of the loyal Southerner, who, yes, may have been from the South and dedicated to Southern ideology and identity and even slavery, but he was an American above all. Now, there's a key lesson here to think about when it comes to this issue of choosing a running mate. Lincoln chose a running mate with an eye for victory. He wanted to choose a running mate that would best assure victory, where he would set himself up, stylize himself as this unity ticket, as this national figure, the man who was fighting to preserve the United States in opposition to George McClellan, who offered a very different path going forward. And that's why he chose Andrew Johnson. He chose trying to maximize his electoral appeal. Well, that could make sense, but again, contingency, randomness. When Lincoln chooses Andrew Johnson as his running mate, it might make electoral sense. But what a tragedy, because Lincoln is assassinated, and the Southerner, white supremacist, former slaveholder, becomes President of the United States at perhaps the most fateful and important moment in our history, Reconstruction, when everything was possible, everything could be possibly remade, where there was great hope for a resurrection, a rebirth of a nation where freedom and equality was had and available for all. Instead, the nation would be led by Johnson, who, despite being elected, or being president, not elected, being thrust into the presidency as a result of an assassination, he would attempt to take control of Reconstruction and steer the course of the nation in line with his values. Lincoln, in his final speech before he's assassinated, came out in favor of black suffrage, the right of black men to vote. In that sense, Lincoln established a template going forward for what Reconstruction could be. But Johnson, who inherits the White House as a result of this great tragedy where Lincoln himself is killed by a white supremacist, John Wilkes Booth, rather than follow the lead of Lincoln, rather than see himself as a man who is thrust in this position not from the will of the people, but from, again, the actions of another white supremacist and a great tragedy, the first assassination in American history, Johnson would take over like he had just won a landslide himself and steer the nation far away from the template that Lincoln had established for Reconstruction, with tragic results, as we will see in this series of lectures. This is a period known as presidential Reconstruction, where Johnson comes in as president after the assassination and assumes that, well, now as president, he can direct Reconstruction. And he does so in a way that, again, reflects his Southern sympathies, white supremacy, his dedication to accepting the end of slavery. That was a condition of the South's surrender. The 13th Amendment had already been ratified and added to the Constitution. When the South surrenders, they are accepting reintegration into a nation now where slavery is no more. But beyond that, Johnson wasn't going to do anything to extend rights, liberties, and freedoms to former slaves. Presidential Reconstruction, his vision of Reconstruction, was very conciliatory towards the South, welcoming them in with no punishment, no demands, restoring private property rights, land to ex-Confederates, those who had risen up in rebellion against this country. Remember, it's Johnson who orders the 40 acres of land that had been doled out by the Union Army to emancipated slaves to repossess that and return it to ex-Confederates. He restored voting rights, political rights. All's forgiven. Let's move on. This very conciliatory approach, which again, you might rightfully chalk up to him being Andrew Johnson, former slave owner, Southerner. Certainly that's what's motivating him, his sympathies, empathy, arguably, for the South. But it's important to note that when Reconstruction begins, when you have this period known as presidential Reconstruction, the majority of Northerners support Johnson for reasons we explained again in that first lecture, America Reborn. They wanted a very conciliatory approach. They weren't interested in a long, difficult, protracted effort to radically remake the South. They weren't interested in the cause of black civil rights. So when Johnson begins this process, it may have galled some the way in which he was so conciliatory to people who are traitors to this nation, who brought the misery of the Civil War to us all. But because so many Northerners were eager to get on with westward expansion, the industrialization of the West, opportunities to own land in the West, because they weren't inclined towards equality and civil rights for African Americans, Johnson enjoyed immediately a great deal of support in the North, enough to overcome whatever misgivings there will be about being so conciliatory towards traitors to this nation. Another element of presidential Reconstruction was the process of creating new state governments in the states that seceded from the Union, where they now had to write new state constitutions that included the one obligation, the only obligation that came with presidential Reconstruction, acknowledging the end of slavery. Again, that was a condition of the South's surrender. That, again, was now mandated under the 13th Amendment, which had been added to the Constitution. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime action, an executive order by a commander-in-chief, but what it called for, the end of slavery, was now codified in the most solid way possible as a constitutional amendment. But other than accepting the end of slavery, under presidential Reconstruction, the process by which the state governments would establish state legislatures, write new state constitutions, under Johnson's plan, they were allowed complete free hand. Do as you please. And that meant, of course, they could create new state governments that offered no rights to former slaves. Now, this is one of the key issues of Reconstruction. It's one of the key issues that came with Northern victory. All right, we've abolished slavery. These 4 million human beings who before the war were enslaved and defined as property are no longer slaves. But who are they? Presidential Reconstruction, particularly in the way in which it gave free hand to southern states to write their state constitutions as they see fit, was dedicated to making sure that these former slaves may no longer be slaves, but they have absolutely no rights whatsoever. Former slaves wanted to vote, they wanted to own land, they wanted to be free in the ways that, again, we described in our first lecture on Reconstruction. But the goal of ex-Confederates was win the peace, maintaining economic, political, and social control in the hands of whites only. And under presidential Reconstruction, these southern states were allowed to do that with free hand. You may indeed create new governments where former slaves have absolutely no rights at all, where they can't vote, where they are denied any rights, power, or privilege. So this is presidential Reconstruction, welcoming in these 11 states that seceded from the Union with no conditions, no demands. And one of the tragic elements of Reconstruction, one of the reasons perhaps Civil War and Reconstruction still haunt us to this day, is the lack of any punishment for the South. I mentioned in our first look at Reconstruction, our most recent lecture, there's no compensation for former slaves, no reparations, no 40 acres and a mule. And that's an open wound that has never healed. That's something we've never acknowledged and wrestled with. Owning that, repairing that, paying back that debt. And then also, even in the latter periods of Reconstruction, which we will soon look at, where there is a very different movement and the radical Republicans are in charge, even then, very few Southerners are ever tried for their actions during the Civil War, atrocities committed. Only one Confederate officer is executed for his actions. That was the warden of the notorious Andersonville prison, where many Union troops were tortured and abused and deprived of basic necessities. Jefferson Davis, he lives a long life. He goes without punishment. So many of the key figures in the Confederacy never go without punishment. And yeah, maybe that's why Civil War and Reconstruction still haunt us, because there was never a punishment for, again, secession and the ruinous war that followed. And that was the template first established here under presidential Reconstruction, and even when the radicals take control, it prevails. And it's important to note that at this point, in the early period of Reconstruction, from 1865 to late 1866, early 1867, the period we could earmark and delineate as presidential Reconstruction, this has strong support in the North, because most Northerners wanted a very conciliatory approach. They weren't interested in the efforts to create equality and opportunity for African Americans. They, again, were motivated what had always motivated them: economic interest, namely westward expansion. But a couple things are going to happen here that are going to open the door to a different path, open the door to radical Reconstruction. One is the dogged determination of the radical Republicans not to see this prevail, that we're not going to let Andrew Johnson write the script of Reconstruction. Remember, radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens were lifelong abolitionists, and abolitionism was always about not just ending slavery, but creating equality after slavery. And radical Republicans won't let this moment where we're hitting the reset button slip away, and they're not going to allow Andrew Johnson, a guy who's president because of a white supremacist killing Lincoln, to write the script of Reconstruction. Also, when these southern states are allowed free hand, they take measures that will anger and alienate even moderate Northerners. And so, as we're about to talk about, a theater will open up for moderates to join with the radicals because they're angry about the way in which the South is left off the hook, an anger that's agitated consciously and deliberately, passionately, persuasively by radical Republicans who are more than willing to reopen the raw wounds of the Civil War and demand change and retribution. And also, these southern states who have free hand will violate some principles that are important to Northerners. So the first phase is presidential Reconstruction, but it's not the final phase. But it is a period where Andrew Johnson is following this template of reconciliation, forgiveness, and a lack of punishment for ex-Confederates, as well as empowering whites and whites alone to create new state governments in the states that seceded from the Union and now were being returned to the Union in a reconstructed nation. The southern states, given free hand, pass a series of laws that are designed to address the status of former slaves. The state conventions that were held under presidential Reconstruction that draft new state constitutions for these states reintegrated into the Union were completely made up of white Southerners, most of them people who are active in the Confederacy, many of them former slave owners. And so they write state constitutions that allow only whites to vote. They elect state legislatures comprised solely of whites, most of them ex-Confederates and former slave owners. And those southern governments, those southern states, pass a series of laws known as the Black Codes. Black Codes refer to a series of laws passed in presidential Reconstruction prior to 1866 and 1865, early 1866, that are part of this process of presidential Reconstruction where such southern states have been given free hand. And they're designed to advance the cause of win the peace, concentrating power, privileges, and rights in the hands of whites only, and deny rights, power, and privileges to African Americans. They're designed to clarify the status of former slaves. They're not slaves, but who are they? These Black Codes basically denied any rights to former slaves. They could not testify in court against whites. They could not serve on juries or state militias or vote. Now, a lot of these opportunities, well, you might not be typically keen about, right? Nobody wants to serve on a jury. You get that jury duty notice in the mail, you're pissed, right? Because it's going to ruin your life in some way. You're going to have to take off time from work. You're going to miss a precious college course, right? So people don't like to serve on juries. No one wants to go to court and testify, right? But think about each of these rights or duties or practices. They are the things that you do because you're a citizen. That's what you hear when you get jury duty, right? This is your duty as a citizen, right? Citizenry involves certain rights, but also responsibilities. And what we have here is an enumeration of things associated with citizenship. Citizens serve on juries. Citizens can serve in state militias. Citizens can have their day in court and seek redress if they're wronged, if they're abused by another citizen. And of course, as we've said prior and returned to here, the key marker of being a citizen in America in the 1800s was the right to vote. So, though you may not be too interested in serving on juries or testifying in court, you know that you do that. You get that jury duty notice because you're a citizen of this state, a citizen of this nation. And so what we have here at the Black Codes is a deliberate effort to go down the line and deny every marker of citizenship to former slaves. Again, one of the key issues in Reconstruction is the status of ex-Confederates and the status of former slaves. Presidential Reconstruction granted, in terms of status, to ex-Confederates full citizenship, full rights, all's forgiven, little or no punishment. And then the other side of the status question, in regards to former slaves, it said, you may not be a slave, but you're not a citizen, and you don't get any of the markers of citizenship. But the most galling and troubling aspect of the Black Codes, and the reason why they're so key in sparking that backlash that will urge moderate Northerners to get radical, is that they required African Americans to enter labor contracts with ex-Confederate landowners. As we saw with the letter from Jordan Anderson to his old master, there's a great concern among the landowners in the Reconstruction South about retaining a labor force. Because with the end of slavery, slaves were no longer the property of these ex-Confederates, and they were no longer a captive labor force that you can push out into the field every day. And yeah, you got your land back, but your land's not really worth much and valuable unless you have people to work that land. And so there's a great concern among the landowning elite in the now post-slavery South about where they're going to find labor. And the Black Codes was designed to address that. Under the Black Code, certain jobs, certain professions, certain occupations were denied to African Americans. You can't work as a carpenter. You can't work as a stevedore unloading ships. A free labor ideology and free labor system does not prevail in the post-slavery South. What was the great hope of many in the North, that a free labor system would now prevail nationwide, it doesn't materialize, because under the Black Codes, African Americans are denied the chance to work in occupations. Free labor is all the idea. You decide where you work. Command the highest wage, right? Well, a free labor system does not prevail in the South for 100 years after the Civil War, because so many professions in a variety of ways are cut off to African Americans. So they can't work as carpenters. They can't work as tradesmen. They're denied land, as we've said now many times. And this was all an effort to force African Americans, emancipated individuals, into being a captive labor force who would be forced to work on land restored to ex-Confederates. And as part of that, there were these laws set up as part of the Black Codes that obliged African Americans to sign labor contracts. If you did not have an active job, you could be incarcerated for being idle, being unemployed, being a vagrant. Part of the Black Codes were these vagrancy laws that said if any African American isn't in active labor, he or she could be arrested and then forced into these contracts. Well, okay, that makes sense as an outgrowth of a state government where only whites are in charge, right? They would pass such laws. It certainly makes sense from an economic point of view because landowners need labor and slavery is no more. But think about what we just described here under the Black Codes, this denial of certain pursuits of labor, wage labor, denial of a chance to work in certain occupations, and being forced thereby into labor contracts. That is the opposite of free labor. So in these lectures, I've been stressing to you that the best way to understand the majority opinion of Northerners after the Civil War is to reflect on the majority opinion of Northerners before the Civil War. They're not abolitionists. They were dedicated to, again, wage labor as the future, as the force that makes men free, as the system that should prevail across the nation. Commercial farming, the right of the little guy to own land and participate in the market revolution, that is what matters to Northerners. That's why they rallied around the Republican Party. That's why they voted for Lincoln. That's what they were fighting for. They weren't abolitionists. They weren't fighting for a notion of black equality. And under the Black Codes, you get the opposite of free labor. You get this, forcing individuals into these labor contracts. And that does anger Northerners. What do we fight for if in the end a free labor system is denied to Southerners, even African Americans? So under the black codes, maybe there isn't such an objection to the idea that blacks can't vote in the North, but this is galling. This is unsettling. This does demonstrate that the South is not, as Northerners believed, falling in line with the new economy of wage labor, that a free labor system is not prevailing, that you could force individuals who are not slaves into forced labor. That's what is happening here, and that does anger Northerners. So the black codes not only denied markers of citizenship and participation in certain forms of political freedom to former slaves, it basically denied them economic liberty, economic freedom. It was designed to force them into labor contracts where they would be a captive labor force on the land owned by ex-Confederates. Another part of the black codes meant that their children, too, were subject to these vagrancy laws, and if found to be idle, not employed, not working, they could be forced into work without the consent of their parents. Again, one of the other key liberties, hopes for African Americans, something that the end of slavery seemed to symbolize, was finally control over your family. You didn't have that under slavery. Your children could be sold away from you. You could be sold away from your children. Your children could be beaten and raped by whites with impunity. So freedom meant governance and control over your children, but not under the black codes. So now children are also being pressed into an unfree system of labor. Again, this is what you get with presidential Reconstruction. This is what you get when you allow ex-Confederates to design the new state governments of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Virginia. Black codes. But because the black codes, in addition to the ways in which the South is being left off the hook here without punishment, because the black codes violate what did matter to Northerners, free labor principles, what they were fighting for, what they believed would now be the rule across the nation, north, south, east, and west. The black codes exemplify how Southern states go too far and open the door to a different path from presidential Reconstruction, one that the radical Republicans are more than willing to offer. The North does react with great anger and venom towards the black codes, which baldly violate free labor principles. And then on top of that, there's that sense that nothing has changed, that Southerners are going without punishment. And this, of course, is something the radicals play into. Radical Republicans, as we've said many, many times, are true believers in human equality and believers in this idea that now America must be redeemed and resurrected into a nation of freedom and equality for all. And they're also very skilled orators. They're very skilled at making that case. If you have an unpopular point of view, and abolitionism and black equality is a very unpopular point of view in 19th century America, you better get damn good at making that argument. And Thaddeus Stevens and others were. They would take to the floor of the House. They would wave that bloody shirt, which was a symbol of the lack of change in the South, that Northerners were still being beaten and bloodied even after the war. They would point to the black codes and say, Americans, not slaves anymore, but Americans, are being forced into labor. Could that happen to you too? Right? Remember that idea of slave power, the idea that the small cadre of slave owners seem to dictate national policy. Well, it seemed to be in the offing, seemed to be present now as the former slaveholders remained in control of the South. And so there's this violation of free labor principles. There's a sense that the South isn't being punished, that it's unrepentant, that it's still attacking Northern bodies in a bloody shirt metaphor. And then there's those radicals who are really good at making that argument, agitating passion and emotion, anger that the South seems to be failing to acknowledge. It lost, and now it must pay. It must change. Nothing seems to be changing. They're being left off the hook. They are going without punishment. Their rights have been restored, and they're seizing those political powers and rights to deny equality and opportunity by this open violation of free labor principles. So, again, as we said at the beginning of this lecture, Reconstruction has three different phases. There's presidential Reconstruction, Andrew Johnson, Southerner, former slaveholder, I know what to do, I'm going to take over, and we've seen what that means. But when presidential Reconstruction unfolds, there are elements of it that gall and anger Northerners, even those who are not abolitionists. And then you've got our radicals who are standing on the sidelines and saying, you know what? We have a different vision of Reconstruction, where the South is punished. The South must pay. The South must acknowledge its defeat. And indeed, a free labor system prevails, where all, black or white, in the South and around the nation are able to sell their labor for money and be free individuals in a way that defines freedom for Northerners, wage labor. So you have to see the two in dialogue. You have to see the two working together, an interplay between presidential Reconstruction and how it creates an opportunity for the radicals to come forward, make their appeal passionately, persuasively, and offer a different template that will speak to Northerners' concerns about a lack of change, a lack of repentance, a lack of defeat. Why did 600,000 people die if nothing changes? Why did 600,000 people die? Your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, if nothing changed. If Lincoln died on Good Friday, a day that Christians acknowledge and commemorate the death of Christ, where's the resurrection? So you got to see this work together, the way in which presidential Reconstruction creates a theater for radicals to make that argument. And that ushers in the second phase, where the radical Republicans say, we have a different plan for Reconstruction. Radical Republicans were congressmen, senators. They came out of the abolitionist movement. They were true advocates for the goals of abolitionism, end slavery, create a new America, reborn, resurrected, where blacks and whites are equal. Some of them, like Thaddeus Stevens, had a radical notion of human equality that extended to women. They were advocates for women's suffrage. One of the other great tragedies of Reconstruction is that an amendment is added to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment, that makes it illegal, unconstitutional, to deny someone the right to vote based on race. But of course, that meant you still could deny someone the right to vote based on sex, and women, therefore, are deliberately excluded from the franchise. That's another tragedy. Thaddeus Stevens wanted to address that too. He wanted changes in America where all, black or white, male or female, could vote. So they really were strong believers in this idea of human equality, and they didn't want to let this moment slip away. We ended slavery, and probably, radically, a war that began as one to preserve the Union became one to end slavery. The radical Republicans were instrumental to that. They're the ones on the floor of the House and Senate criticizing their own Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, and urging him to take up that task. The North wins, slavery is abolished. It's the radical Republicans who get that 13th Amendment through and ratified even before Appomattox. And now it's time to turn to that other goal, create a new America, reborn, resurrected, where all are equal. And we have a theater now for that to be possible, where people who might be moderate when Reconstruction began, conciliatory, eager to again march westward, build railroads, and kill Indians, could be radicalized. Thaddeus Stevens and others take to the floor and they say, look, the South, they did this. They brought this misery to this nation. Who's responsible for the death of your son? South did this, and they better pay. Who's responsible for the death of 600,000 people? The South did this, and they must pay. They brought this horror. They brought this misery. They brought this tragedy to us all. And now, one of their own, Andrew Johnson, the President of the United States, is letting them off the hook. If we sacrificed in this war, what was the sacrifice for? Why did those young men die? Why did Lincoln die? That's a pretty persuasive argument. And when Northerners are being beaten by Southern mobs, that bloody shirt, well, it seems like nothing's changed. When you have this bald assault on the principles of free labor with the black codes, well, that's a persuasive argument. So all this works together. What Johnson did, what Southern states did, and then the antithesis and alternative advanced by people like Stevens, who in very passionate, persuasive language are able to take the sacrifices made in the Civil War and turn it into a cause necessitating dramatic change. And they offer a different path where the South is reconstructed, the South is reformed and changed, where free labor prevails. And with their persuasive means, they're able to get their fellow senators and congressmen who have been more moderate to join with them in the second phase of radical Reconstruction. Well, what was that vision for the radicals? What was their alternative to presidential Reconstruction? In June of 1866, the radical Republicans expressed their very different vision of a new America with the 14th Amendment, which passes through Congress and then is sent to the states for ratification. I've said many times throughout this class that one may argue that the American Civil War is the Second American Revolution. Some see it in that way, one, because of the revolutionary changes of this period, and also two, because it is seen as something that continued or fixed the issues that were not addressed in the original American Revolution of the late 18th century. Well, if you are inclined to see the Civil War as the Second American Revolution, those who make that argument point to the 14th Amendment as that revolutionary shift and break. 14th Amendment is the most important amendment in our Constitution after the Bill of Rights. Some may argue it's even more important than the Bill of Rights. And it really speaks to not just the radicalness of the radical Republicans, the radicalness of this moment, but it really speaks to that idea that what happens during the Civil War and Reconstruction marks this radical, revolutionary break from all of American history prior. Why? 14th Amendment says a number of key things. Most importantly, perhaps, it states that all people born in this country are citizens. One of the issues alive, at stake, in debate, in Reconstruction is what is the status of former slaves? The 13th Amendment says you're not a slave anymore. Slavery is abolished. But what is your status? We've seen what presidential Reconstruction had to say on that. Under the Black Codes, you may be a slave, but you have no rights at all, and we could force you to work for us. 14th Amendment, from the pens, from the ideals of the radical Republicans, very different. 14th Amendment says you are a citizen of this nation. 14th Amendment says everyone born in this country is a citizen. That meant 4 million human beings who were born into slavery, who were under law defined as property, who in the Dred Scott decision just a few years prior were told they could never be members of the American political family. 14th Amendment says you're citizens of this country. What the 14th Amendment did, once it's eventually ratified, was end race-based citizenship. Prior to the 14th Amendment, the only people who were considered eligible to be citizens of this nation, white people. That's in our very first immigration law, passed in 1790, just a couple years after the Constitution is ratified. It says, emphatically, the only people who could ever be citizens, white people. And then through subsequent decades in American law, through the Dred Scott decision of 1857, that was upheld. 14th Amendment says anyone born in this country, citizens. What it did was turn former slaves into citizens. It turned people who prior to the war were considered property into citizens of this nation. It reversed all of American law since our founding and created the end of race-based citizenship. It emphatically answered that question. Who are former slaves? They're citizens of this nation. This is one way in which the 14th Amendment is still with us here in the 21st century, because there are obvious implications for immigration. We have birthright citizenship in this country because of the 14th Amendment. Anyone born in this country is a citizen, regardless of the status of your parents. The radical Republicans realized that. They realized that this would have implication for immigration, and they supported this because they wanted one standard of citizenship. Now, unfortunately, tragically, and to this day in many ways, that's been undermined in a variety of ways, this idea of one standard for citizenship. But that effort to undermine is a product of the fact the 14th Amendment attempted to establish one standard. Radical Republicans said, we can't have a nation where some are citizens, some aren't. You're kind of a citizen, but you're sort of not as a real citizen. No, 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 no. That won't work. Everyone. Everyone. And so we have birthright citizenship, one standard. All people born in this country are citizens. Now, there are certain politicians today who don't like this, and you'll hear every once in a while murmurs about amending the 14th Amendment. You'll hear murmurs about efforts to reverse birthright citizenship. So it certainly gets swept up in the immigration debate today. Radical Republicans realize that this amendment would have implications for the children of immigrants. And they said we need to have one standard so that we do not have people in this nation who are subject to American law but are denied the rights and privileges of that. So citizenship for everyone, in this case, certainly as we focus on the issue of status for former slaves, this was very different than the black codes, which, as we talked about earlier, were consciously created to deny citizenship and rights associated with citizenship to former slaves. 14th Amendment, the exact opposite. All people are citizens. Former slaves and the citizens, a very different vision of what Reconstruction could mean. Also, the 14th Amendment applied the Bill of Rights to states. And so that states and state governments could not pass laws that denied the privileges and immunities of citizenship, the rights under the Bill of Rights, to citizens of that state. And this is clearly an effort to reverse the black codes, where certain states were doing things that denied basic rights, protections, and privileges to states. Now, this too was a radical departure of American law prior, because interpretations of the Bill of Rights prior by the Supreme Court stated that they only apply to the federal government and the issue of federal citizenship, being a citizen of the nation. Those are the people who are protected under things like the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, those liberties associated with freedom of speech, right to a jury trial, to make sure that certain states don't treat their citizens differently, again, because of the color of their skin, i.e. the black codes. Another key aspect of the 14th Amendment was that the Bill of Rights applies to all citizens and to states and their actions in regards to their citizenry. Finally, if this isn't enough, the 14th Amendment also says all citizens, now including African Americans, are guaranteed equal protection of law and the right of due process under law. What was the goal of abolitionism and slavery? That was the 13th Amendment. And also create a new America where blacks and whites are equal. Well, that's the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment ends race-based citizenship, turns former slaves into citizens, recognizes their rights under the Bill of Rights, and guarantees them equal protection of law. This is a very different vision of Reconstruction, advanced here by the radical Republicans, who are now offering their vision as an alternative to presidential Reconstruction. As radical, as significant, as key as the 14th Amendment is, there is one major failing of the 14th Amendment. It is the very first time in American history, the first time in the Constitution, that a gender-specific term is used. It says all male citizens. And this was an effort by the radical Republicans to try to help get this amendment ratified by clarifying these rights only applied to men. And again, I've noted one of the many tragedies of Reconstruction is that not only do we fail to realize a nation of racial equality for all, but we also fail to realize a nation of equality for American women. And we'll talk about this moment where it's possible for African American men to vote, where former slaves are elected to Congress. Well, there is this period with the 14th and 15th Amendment in the late 1860s, early 1870s, where black men can vote. But there's no period in the totality of Reconstruction where American women can vote. After the Civil War, after the 14th and 15th Amendments are ratified, feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton will go to their local polling station and say, I'm a citizen, I was born here in this country, 14th Amendment makes that clear, I'm going to vote. And they'll be arrested. So much of Reconstruction is a failure to become a nation of equality for all. And part of that, unfortunately, is right there in the 14th Amendment, where as radical as it is, ending race-based citizenship, extending equality under law to all citizens, it is also, though, the very first time in American history where a gender-specific term is used, which seems to indicate that only men are citizens and subject to the protections and equality of the 14th Amendment. Also, it doesn't deal with the issue of voting rights, and that's what will later lead to the 15th Amendment, which we'll talk about in our next lecture. But all of this, again, was an effort to try to make it less radical than it potentially could be by limiting the rights to men and not addressing the issue of voting rights in a vain effort to see it ratified in its first go through the state legislatures. Regardless of these failings, regardless of the problems associated with the 14th Amendment, the incompleteness of its vision of equality for all, it does end race-based citizenship. It recognizes former slaves as citizens. It guarantees them equal protection of law. We'll explain how it's eventually ratified in 1868 in our next lecture, but it is ratified. And with it, you have the revolutionary impact of where we're at now, History 114. When the war began, there's no indication, quite the contrary, really, no indication that this will be a war to end slavery. And for contingent factors, it becomes one. And now with the war over, the radical Republicans are attempting even further revolutionary change with the 14th Amendment that recognizes former slaves, African Americans, as citizens and guarantees them equal protection of law. The second goal of abolitionism. I've mentioned this a few times. It's worthy of a mention again because these are such difficult times today in our country. It's easy to be despondent. It is easy to be pessimistic about the future. I don't blame you. I'm pessimistic about the future, partly because I'm a historian and we're the most pessimistic people on earth, right? But certainly there's just cause for being concerned about our collective future and the prospects of positive progressive change right now. But look, in the 1830s, 1840s, if you were an abolitionist and you said, we're going to end slavery, we're going to create a new America where blacks can vote, people would laugh at you. They would see you as a fool. You were trying to end the most powerful, profitable slave regime in human history. You were trying to create something that had never existed before in American life, equality under law for non-whites. And yet, many of those abolitionists would live to see the ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendment. So there's presidential Reconstruction, and then there's radical Reconstruction. Hopefully you can see quite the contrast here. You can also appreciate why the 14th Amendment, the crown jewel of the radical Republicans' efforts, is so revolutionary. And in our next lecture, we'll talk about how the 14th and also the 15th Amendments eventually become ratified, continuing our story of radical Reconstruction.